Welcome back. Well, bombshell headlines about this potential deal between China and the Solomon Islands and exactly what it might mean for Australia and our security. Joining me live now is US Studies Centre CEO Simon Jackman. Thanks very much for your time. It's something that's getting a lot of people talking. Yes, we don't know exactly if this will come to fruition, but the potential breadth of it is what will be concerning people in Australia.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And Tom, Canberra's had its eyes on the Pacific for a long time, understanding China's ambitions for influence in the region. This one has been perhaps a long one in the making. Look, it reveals what I think is a deeper structural issue for Australia. There are an awful lot of micronations around the Pacific for China to cuddle up to make inducements to its leaders. It's a very difficult game for Australia and allies to counter. It's a little bit of whack-a-mole. You know, each country sticks its hand up and says, look, China's come to us with this. What are you going to do about it? Be it PNG, be it Vanuatu, the Solomons. You remember a couple of years ago, at very short notice, one of the fastest things I've seen DFAT ever do was to essentially issue a no-bid contract for a telecommunications cable to the Solomons. We're sort of reacting, it seems to me, a lot of the time, and you know what we need, I think, is a little more pro-action. But there's a real moral hazard problem here too. It's almost, if you're one of these Pacific micronations, it's a little bit of a bidding war between, do I throw my lot in with the West or do I throw my lot in with China? And so that's a difficult aspect of this too, and hence the need for, I think, a really comprehensive sort of whole of society engagement with those societies, being the whole of society, that sort of inoculates Australia from this more being picked off or being enticed into off on a bidding game to counter, you know, persistent and ever increasing Chinese attempts to establish influence in our backyard.
Yeah, and I guess you get to the point of you're only as good as the willpower or the altruistic nature of your politicians. And when you've got the potential for these short-term gains and political terms that don't last very long, how's a new stadium here, how's a new hospital there, it's hard for people to turn them down, even though they might know deep down in 20 years it might not be the best decision for their country.
You've hit the nail on the head, Tom, right? And this is why do we talk about the transparency of democratic institutions? Because it's very hard when you've got strong liberal democratic institutions in place. Not here in Australia I'm talking about in some of these Pacific micronations. When you've got strong democratic institutions in place, there are real costs to leaders taking on these contracts from and offers of assistance from powers like China that are frankly then pretty easily and not so transparently parlayed into patronage for their supporters and so on. Daylight here, sunlight, this great disinfectant that is a concomitant of liberal democratic institutions helps inoculate those countries from themselves going further down the road towards authoritarianism themselves. And that's what I mean by a more structural, comprehensive approach that has locking in real commitment to democratic institutions across the board, has economic aid in engagement, but critically, it's the power of liberal democratic institutions that do so much to sort of keep the wolf at bay, as it were, when it comes to these sorts of efforts to establish influence from powers that, frankly, don't value democracy.
And you've perhaps got to be a really good exemplar of a liberal democracy. Perhaps we are sometimes. Let me ask you about this, though. Fascinated by this headline about the ANZUS treaty being invoked. This is over Russia potentially targeting the US over cyber warfare. So the ANZUS treaty, we always think about it in these physical terms, right? A plane, a ship or a soldier, whatever it might be. We're talking the cyber sphere here because Australia can help counter this, but knows it's vulnerable if Russia turns the cyber weapons towards us.
Tom, cyber's been, it was the 2011 OSMIN. So what is that, 11 years ago now, where cyber is explicitly mentioned in the communique and almost expressly being added to, the Article 5 provisions of the ANZUS Treaty, you know, the then governments of the US and Australia at that time clearly looking ahead at contingencies like the one we may well be on the eve of. The other thing to note is, and the US official that was talking about this the other day, she pointed out, and Canberra counterparts would say the same, there is already extensive, deep, almost day-to-day, hour-by-hour cooperation between Australian and American security officials in this domain, number one. So it's not a huge escalation or a revolution, I think, operationally. And moreover, it's been on the books for a good 11 years. So I think there's an awful lot of cooperation that we're perhaps not reading about in the paper every day, happening all the time as it stands. The final point I'd make on this one, Tom, is that it says something about Australian capability. It may come as a surprise to some Australians to think that Australia could actually have something to add to America's formidable cyber capabilities. The answer is yes, and it says something about the distributed nature of the internet and also the huge investments and ongoing investments we're making as a nation in our cyber defensive capability, but increasingly, Tom, our cyber offensive capability as well, something we've done in deep cooperation with the United States of America.
Simon, great to get your thoughts as ever. Thank